He really does it. And I'm going to point out before you leave, he did scare up a few copies of some of his books. He's been sold out of so many, but there are a few that are available for purchase. And then there are some cards next to the books, and if you turn those over, they all have a recipe on the back. So I guess you can, there's 3 recipes available there. Okay, so
No.
if we talked about, shouldn't we have samples? Oh my gosh, we just couldn't figure out a way to make it warm, so something, someone would have had to be in the kitchen this whole time and bringing it up. But I'm gonna vouch for it, because this recipe is not there, but his macaroni and cheese, which was in the
New York
Washington Post,
New York Times.
New York Times, sorry, New York Times is so good and so rich, and you don't even boil the noodles. Oh, see, anybody who cooks says, oh, really?
I'll explain it. I'll explain it when we get to
You know, it's hot with all the pasta boiling. So you put in the dry pasta into this, and it's works like a charm. It's like, if you follow the recipe, it is perfect. It's so good. Anyway, now to the other stuff about it. So more important thing, he went to Stanford University, and he has a law degree from Georgetown. He served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton. And I thought you did something for Obama too.
No.
Somebody else told me that. See the rumors about it. I'll take this. Yeah, right. And he was he worked with Bill Clinton on the Initiative for One America, the first freestanding office in the White House to address issues of racial, religious, and ethnic reconciliation. I wonder if they can hear. I don't know.
Yeah, we tested it.
I mean, can they hear me? Is this where it's coming from?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody,
I don't know. I'm sorry. This will be, well, he'll be talking soon.
I think they could.
Okay, good. Then Adrian worked for Governor Bill Ritter from 2004 to 2010. And he served on the board for the Southern Foodways Alliance at that time. In June of 2019, he lectured in the Masters of Gastronomy program at the Università di Scienze Gastronomiche in Firenze, Italy.
That's really good.
I said, I can pronounce anything, but I may not understand. He's currently the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, and as such is the first African-American and the first layperson to hold that position. My friend, Adrian Bella.
Thank you, Tricia, and thanks to so many of you. I know it's Super Bowl Sunday, but we're gonna have a lot of fun talking about soul food. So what I'm gonna do is kind of give you a sense of my journey, and then tell you how I came to write these books, and then give you the backstory for soul food, and then we'll go through a typical soul food meal, and then we'll talk about the current trend in soul food, and then I'd be happy to have your questions. My sister over here, she did something I love. She came up to me after the service and said, "How come you didn't include sweet tea?" So all you Southerners or people who are into soul food, please feel comfortable arguing with Lizzie. I love it. All right. I'm the soul food scholar, dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. I worked really hard on that slogan. If you are on social media, feel free to follow me. I'm Soul Food Scholar on most platforms. So if you find something in this presentation that you love, please tag me, share, tell others about me. I would love that. I just passed 32,000 followers on Instagram. I'm very close to 28,000 on Twitter. So just need more followers. Now, if there's something you just don't like or you hate this presentation, you don't have to do social media. Let's hold on to that. So my writing journey. So yeah, as you know, I grew up in Denver, which immediately loses me all street cred on the subject of soul food. So the way I win people back is I tell them my parents are from the South. My mom's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad is from Helen, Arkansas. Are you from Chattanooga? Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Howard High is where my mom went. Okay. So they moved to Denver. My mom and dad moved to Denver separately, great migration story, and then met in Denver in the 60s. And so even in an unlikely place in Denver, I'm grateful that my parents kept me steeped in Black tradition. So I had soul food, barbecue, and I went to a Black church in the inner part of Denver. So I'm very grateful my parents did that, because they easily could have put that aside, right? So being out in the suburbs of Denver, but they kept me connected. So went to Stanford, then went to Georgetown, and came back, practiced law in Denver, for about 4 years. Now, this is not to disparage anybody who is an attorney, or if you have attorneys in your family. The practice of law was just not for me. It got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. And you know it's bad because white people were joining in. We go to the copier and I talk to one of my colleagues, Becky, and I say, hey, Becky, how's it going? She would just look at me and say, nobody knows. So I was going to open up a soul food restaurant. If you're familiar with Denver's restaurant scene, I had the early track on Cuba at Fulton, Delaware. I had a chef, I was raising money, and then a friend of mine from law school called me up out of the blue and said, hey, Adrian, I just got a job in the Clinton White House on this thing called the Initiative for One America. Do you have any friends back in DC, because I'm still in my law office in Denver, who might be interested in working on this? And I said, well, tell me more about it. So President Clinton had something called the Initiative on Race. And here's the wild and crazy idea behind the Initiative on Race. If we talk to one another and listen, we might realize that we have a lot more in common than what's supposedly divided. Crazy, right? So that went on for two years. The late John Hope Franklin chaired that. And when it was done, the people running that said, Mr. President, you need to have an ongoing office in the White House that deals with these issues. That became the Initiative for One America. So when my friend told me this, she asked me to recruit somebody else. I did the same thing that Dick Cheney did. George W. Bush asked him to find a vice president. I was the head of the search committee. My name was the only one on the list. So I went there and I really enjoyed my time in the White House. I had only one quibble. Now, has anybody here ever met President Clinton? Okay, please tell us about the experience.
Well, I was like low-level person schlepping stuff in Tokyo when they visited. And so when he's right in front of you, it was like you're the only person in the room. And then when he moves to the next person, you're forgotten.
Wow, that's almost perfect. Okay, tell us about your experience.
And it's exactly what you said.
Yeah.
And he worked very closely with Hillary. They played people very, very well. And they were wonderful with Chelsea. They protected her. She was not a president's kid.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's what people say. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. He draws you in. I worked for him for 1.5 years and I never got that. Every time I talked to him, I would say, Mr. President, I get a blank look, kind of like the one you're giving me right now. I'm Adrian Miller, blank look. And then I'd say, I work on your One America initiative. And then he would say something like, oh, that's right. And then we would talk about it. And then a woman would walk by and he'd call her out by name. I was like, ah. So at that time of my life, I wanted to be the senator from Colorado. So I was trying to get back to Denver and start my political career. But the job market was really slow. I was watching a lot of daytime television. I'm not even going to tell you what shows. And in the depth of my depravity, I said, you know, I should read something. So I went to a local bookstore and I found this book on the history of Southern food. Now, I'd always liked to cook. And I opened this book. It was called Southern Food at Home, on the Road in History, written in 1989. I'm reading it in 2001. And on page 4, the author, John Edgerton, wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cooking has yet to be written. I thought that was really interesting. I tracked him down on the internet and I asked him, I said, Mr. Edgerton, I know this book's 14 years old. I really loved your book, but you wrote this one sentence. Do you still think this is true? And he said, for the most part, nobody's taken on the full story. So with no qualifications at all, except for eating a lot of soul food and cooking it some, that's what started the journey. So I did get back to Denver. I did get a political job. I was working at the Bell Policy Center, progressive think tank, if any of you know about it. And then I got the job with Governor Ritter when he got elected. And so I was like an amateur grad student. So on the evenings and weekends, I would get everything I could on Black food traditions. I'm blessed to live in a community that has a world-class library. And so what I couldn't get at the Denver Public Library, I could get through the interlibrary loan system, and they had all these databases. So I was getting everything I got that I could. So the corpus of my 3 books relied on this research. I read 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people. I don't know if you know this, but in the 1930s, as part of the Federal Works Progress Administration, they started something called the Federal Writers Project. So President Roosevelt employed a ton of writers. And one of the projects was just to find formerly enslaved people who were enslaved at their birth, and interviewed them. And they're all sitting in the Denver Public Library in hardbound. So I read all of those. I read 500 cookbooks, half of them authored by African Americans, because I wanted to put Black food traditions in a larger culinary context. So I wanted to see what was going on in other cultures and what was similar. And then I read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles. A lot of them are now digitized, they weren't searchable. And I talked to hundreds of people about soul food traditions. And then because I care so deeply about my subject, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities and 15 states. My brother here, I can tell he's surprised I'm still alive. I can tell, yeah. And I guess I am too. And so, yeah, so that's what formed the research. And I went from not knowing if I could even write one book, because I reached out to other older African-American, more established food writers to just see if what Mr. Edgerton was saying was true. And they said, look, this country's racist. These cooks have not been celebrated. You're not going to find that much. So I didn't think I'd have enough to cobble together even one book. And because now, you know, these writers didn't know about this newfangled thing called the internet. And with the internet, I had enough material to write 5 books. So that's why I created Soul Food, the Surprising Story of an American Cuisine. And I wrote it this way. I created a representative soul food meal. I wrote a chapter about every part of the meal, and I explained what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, and what it means for the culture. And then most of the chapters have recipes, traditional, health conscious, and then a fancy one in case you want to show off as a cook. So I won the James Beard Award for that, which is the highest honor you can get in food writing. So that was a huge blessing. And then from that research on soul food, I came across the stories of a few African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. And I said, okay, well, if I can find more, I will make that my next book. And that became The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of the African Americans who have fed our families from the Washingtons to the Obamas, because I actually ended it during the Trump administration, but I didn't want to put them on book. So I ended it with the Obamas. And so through that research, I identified 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents. If you were to put all of the presidential cooks in a room, most of them would have been African American and especially Black women. Those were the ones who cooked for our president. Every president of the United States has had an African American cook for them in some capacity. So that tells their collective story. That book was nominated for an NAACP Image Award for Best Literary Nonfiction, and also a Colorado Book Award for History. I did not win, but I got closer to a lifelong goal. I always wanted to meet the actress Halle Berry. The NAACP Image Awards, she was one of the presenters. So here's the progress I made, y'all. We were in the same building at the same time. Now, if you actually go back and look at a recording of that ceremony, when she's presenting her words, there is a moment where she stumbles over her words as she's presenting the award. That's the exact moment when our eyes met. Even though I was sitting way up in the balcony. And then my latest book is Black Smoke, African Americans in the United States Barbecue, mainly because if you look at barbecue storytelling, TV, magazines, newspapers, whatever, it's all about white dudes. And I was tired of that. And so I wanted to write a book that celebrated African American barbecue culture and just said, hey, if you're going to talk about barbecue in the United States, you have to talk about African Americans. They've made significant contributions. Those of you, most of you, I'm sure in this room, got your first taste of barbecue probably made by an African American, especially if you're in the South. This current generation, there are a lot of people that don't have that experience. So I just wanted to celebrate that. And that book was also, also won the James Beard Award for Scholarship and Reference and the Colorado Book Award for History. So that's the writing journey. Now look, I know this room is warm, and so you're probably gonna get sleepy, so I'm gonna do a lot to give corny jokes just to keep y'all awake. So get ready for that. So the first question I often get asked is, well, where does this term soul food come from? Most people say it started in the 1960s. You had very strong expressions of Black identity, Black power movement, Black is beautiful. But the actual first joining of the word soul and food in the English language goes back to Shakespeare. Does anybody know what Shakespeare's first play was? Oh, your high school English teacher will be so disappointed. All right, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. And in this play, there's a really sexy guy named Proteus who walks by two women named Julia and Lucetta. And Julia says to Lucetta, oh, knowest thou not that his looks are my soul's food? Pity the death that I find it in by longing for that food so long a time. So that's the first reference. So what are the takeaways? First of all, even in the late 16th century, Not unusual for two girlfriends to get together and describe a guy as yummy. That's the first one, right? But then we've got this intangible thing going on. This gets to the heart of the soul food context in English, which is that African Americans, because of centuries of oppression, what we do are the most elemental expressions of humanity, right? When we do something, we put our soul in it. But for the next 400 years, soul food meant doing anything to edify your spiritual life, listening to sermons, reading scripture, singing hymns. Fast forward to the late 1940s, you've got a group of jazz artists, African-American jazz artists, people like Ray Charles and others who are miffed. And they're miffed because white jazz musicians were the ones who were getting the best gigs, the most fame, a lot of popularity. So they consciously took this music to a place where they thought that white musicians could not mimic the sound. And that was the sound of the Black church in the rural South. So in the late 1940s and early 1950s, if you're a jazz fan, you probably noticed that there's a gospel-tinged jazz that emerges. The musicians described that sound as soulful and funky. So it was really soul music first, and then it started to gain traction in other parts of Black culture. Soul music, soul brothers, soul sisters, soul food. So we could easily be calling this funky food, but that's not very appetizing, right? Soul is the one that sticks. But what does happen in the 1960s is that soul does go mainstream as a concept, and it starts to become divisive. So before this, everything was called Southern cooking or down-home cooking or country cooking. Soul food did get cultural traction outside the Black community in the 1960s, and there was actually a manifesto that was leaked to the New York Times in 1966 and by some Black Power advocates. And the purpose behind this was the Black Power advocates were trying to figure out, how do we unite African Americans across the United States who are experiencing oppression differently? Certainly what was happening in the rural South resonated, but what was happening in the cities outside the South was different. And so they turned the culture off, right? In addition to the political and talking about social justice, they turned to cultural things like food, and food is a great connector. So this manifesto says that white people can't understand things like cornbread, beans, and listed all of these soul food items. Now, this was news to white Southerners because they had been eating the same foods for 200 years, right? But in the 60s, soul becomes Black and Southern becomes white. And we're living with that split today. So if you remember, this is on the left here is a scene from the movie Soul Food, a beautifully shot film. And then you've got Paula Deen. So often I would ask audiences, name somebody associated with soul food in television. Paula Deen comes out more often than anybody else. All right. And that shows you just how the script has been flipped. So right now, one of the discussions that's going on is this idea of culinary justice. Like, how do we bring back and highlight Black contributions to Southern food, especially now that it's trending? Okay, if we're going to talk about African-American history, most people of African heritage trace their roots to this part of Africa. So I'm defining West Africa as the band of countries along the coastline, the Atlantic coastline, starting with Senegal in the north, going all the way to Angola in the south. We don't see it here. In West Africa, the culinary tradition is this. It's usually a savory soup, stew, or sauce that's served on top of or alongside of some starch. And there's different starch traditions, right? So it's from Senegal to Sierra Leone. There's actually an indigenous type of rice. It was a reddish colored rice that exists there. In the middle part, it's more about cereals. So sorghum, millet, later cornmeal when it's introduced. And then as you go further south, it's about root crops. So yams, cassava, plantains, right? So here is a meal from a West African place in Denver. So on the left here, you've got something called fufu. So fufu is pounded yam that's pounded to the consistency of mashed potatoes. And then on the right side, you have tilapia fish steaks with spicy chilies, tomatoes, and kind of greens mixed together. So the idea is you would break off some of the fufu, and then you would get some of the fish and that sauce and kind of eat it all with your hands. Very delicious stuff. Unfortunately, this restaurant closed. I think it had a lot to do with the name of the restaurant. It was the Palace Nigerian Food and Philly Cheesesteaks. So here is a representation of the Middle Passage, that horrific journey that enslaved Africans had to make across the Atlantic Ocean to get to the Americas. This journey would be 10 to 12 weeks, depending on where you left in Africa and where you disembarked in the Americas. During this journey, the enslaved were kept below deck and only allowed to come up twice a day for eating, exercising, and bathing. And that's where a lot of the slave rebellions happened, because that was the opportunity. And during the slave trade, the early years of the slave trade, the enslaved were fed rotten European food. Well, the mortality rates got so high that the slavers had to change, because it was an economic calculus for them, right? They just needed enough of this human cargo to be alive to make money. They started feeding the enslaved the food that they were used to, wherever they were from in Africa, okay? And we know that mortality rates are high because there are actually journal diaries talking about sharks following slave ships as they would throw dead bodies overboard. So horrific stuff. Now, the other thing to note here is that of the 10 to 12 million people that come across the Atlantic during this time, only 4% come to British North America, what would later become the United States and Canada. So my argument is that soul food is a British meal with West African influences. And then when you eat with someone of African heritage in the Caribbean, Latin America, South America, that's more a West African meal with European influences. Because the way slavery played out was different in this part of the world. There were a lot more enslaved people here. They had more sovereignty and control over their diet. And there was also similarity in climate. So a lot of West African things could be transplanted there. This is just an ad from a newspaper, Charleston, South Carolina, May 1st, 1769. I just show you this because if you look in the text here, it talks about the enslaved being from the Windward Coast or rice country. So we know that slavers were very cognizant of who they had below deck. We also know that enslaved Africans were specifically brought here because of the agricultural and cattle raising knowledge that they had to build industries in the US and make people quite wealthy. Rice was hugely profitable before the 20th century, and people got fabulously wealthy. And Africans were brought here just because of their rice growing knowledge. One of the things that's interesting is that after slavery takes root here, slaveholders decided that they would try to control food of the enslaved. And so on the large plantations, which were only about 40%, most enslaved people were on small farms or lived in cities. People were fed once a week 5 pounds of some starch, rice, cornmeal, sweet potatoes, a couple of pounds of smoked, salted, dried, or pickled meat, usually pork because that was easiest, and a jug of molasses. That's all the enslaved got. So the enslaved had to figure out how to survive by gardening, fishing, foraging, and hunting to supplement that diet. So the 3 M's, meal, cornmeal, molasses, and meat, pork, kind of typify that. But we see a way that the enslaved kind of replicate West African food ways. So along the coastline of South Carolina, Georgia, to some extent North Carolina, the enslaved would ask for, instead of cornmeal, they wanted rice. And so Hoppin' John, black-eyed peas and rice, which has a corollary in West Africa, those kind of dishes emerge. So we see an attempt by enslaved people to assert their humanity. Here's an example of a plantation. The big house would be over here where the slaveholding family left. Beyond the pasture would be the area where the commodity crop was grown, tobacco, cotton, indigo. Remember, cotton comes much later. It was really tobacco and indigo in the first years. Cotton comes much later. But here I want to point out where these numbers are. That's the dwellings of the enslaved. And below it, it says Negro gardens. So that shows you that there were plots of land that the enslaved were given to grow food. And if they could grow foods from West Africa, they did. But often, you know, the climate didn't match up. You were going from a tropical climate to a temperate climate or maybe subtropical. But some plants do come over, black-eyed peas, okra, watermelon. They had sesame seeds, they call them bene, hibiscus. Those are some of the African ingredients or foods that come over. And then the poultry ground. So the enslaved were allowed to raise livestock as well. And in many cases, slaveholders would allow the enslaved to go to a nearby town on the weekends when the work schedule slowed on the plantation to sell excess produce and livestock in the nearby town. And so we have examples of enslaved people buying their freedom because they made enough money on those sales. Something that we don't hear a lot. All right, so fast forward after slavery ends, millions of African Americans leave the South, something called the Great Migration, which plays out over several decades. They come to places like New York City, Boston, DC, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Denver, LA, Portland, Seattle. And my argument is this is when soul food gets its name. Soul food, I argue, is the food that Black people took out of the South and transplanted in other parts of the country. It's I overlap with Southern food, but it's something different because in the South, there's a lot more plentiful ingredients and things to use. And I'll give you an example with greens. We talked about greens during the sermon. The popular soul food greens are collard, mustard, turnip, cabbage, and kale. But in the South, they have all kinds of greens, oak, greasy greens. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff. But it's just what was available on the long truck ride or train ride out of the South that people embrace, right? So they're trying to get a taste of home, but they would, they had to work with what they could get. And when you get to the new place, you're often poor and you struggle. But then when you start to become more successful, you start to eat the good times food of old because you want to show status, right? So soul food is the celebration food of the South. If you think of immigrant foods in this country, what we think is the day in and day out stuff that they eat is usually the celebration food of that country. Because especially if you're a restaurateur, you don't want to show off the ordinary, right? You're usually showing off the special occasion food. And that's what soul food is. And that has implications for the criticism that soul food gets. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. All right, let's go through a typical soul food meal. We talked about this a little bit. Now, these are highlights from my national eating tour. So you've got fried chicken. Now, this is the kind of fried chicken I love. I like well-seasoned, papery thin crust, has a nice crunch when you bite into it. Hopefully, when you place your order, you start to hear some sizzling. That doesn't happen as much, but no, that's the kind of fried chicken that I love. This is from a place called Deborah's Kitchen in Philadelphia. Or you could have smothered chicken. If you're not familiar with smothered chicken, it's similar to the preparation for fried chicken. You flour it, seasoned flour, do a quick fry to seal it, and then you braise it in gravy until it's falling apart. Just delicious. Fried fish, catfish was for a long time the most popular fried fish in soul food, just because it was so easy to raise. In the 1960s, a lot of cotton farmers experienced a depression in the cotton market, and so they just flooded their fields with water and started farming catfish. And so it was very plentiful, but now the industry is going through a lot of challenges, and catfish is outrageously expensive. I mean, I've been to the store, catfish is $8 to $10 a pound. Yeah, so what you're finding is a lot of people are switching to cheaper fish. So you've got the Vietnamese catfish called basa swai. They gave it a fancy name to make it more marketable, but that's just the Vietnamese catfish. Or tilapia. You're seeing more restaurants and other people making tilapia because it's cheaper. This is from a place called Mittendorf's. It's not Black owned, but I thought it was an interesting catfish preparation. So what they do is they get the catfish fillets and then they pound them until they're thin. And then they coat them with cornmeal. And so it's almost like a schnitzel approach when they make it. It's quite good. Then soul food is known for variety meat. So these are the funky cuts, ham hocks, oxtails, which are now crazy expensive, turkey necks, pork necks. These are smoked pork necks with rice and gravy from a place called Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. It's my favorite soul food place in the country. This is the kind of place, well, actually, I won't give that away. I'll show that in a second. So what's interesting now is that with the discovery of whole animal cooking by fine dining chefs, the price of these variety meats have shot up. And here's a great example. So if you were going to Adrian's Soul Food Shack and I sold you pig's feet, they'd be $6, $8, right? But if I did Chez Adrian and I sold you trotters, I would charge you $30. And that's what's happening. People are paying for that. So that's the kind of thing that's going. Chitlins, this is my family's chitlin pots. I eat chitlins. And for those, again, these are pig intestines, usually either fried or braised or stewed. I usually have the stewed method. And I have them only twice a year, Thanksgiving and New Year's. Now, believe it or not, a lot of people say, well, chitlins is like the worst example of soul. And it's the most divisive. You're not going to ever meet somebody who's on the fence about chitlins. Nobody ever says, I kind of like chitlins. They either love them or hate them. I'm on the love side. But this narrative of this is the food that white people don't like, the master's garbage, a lot of this is because of chitlins. And it goes back to the hog killing tradition of the South. They would slaughter a bunch of hogs at one time after the frost. And then they would process the hams, the shoulders, and all these other things. But then the other meats they just gave away because they were ephemeral, right? There was no way to really preserve them. And so chitlins was one of the things that was highly anticipated at that time. And so I think it's unfair because a lot of cultures eat guts. And there are a lot of white people who eat guts. I don't know if you know this, but in Sally, South Carolina, late August every year, White people host something called the Great Chitlin Festival. Okay, it's the Great Chitlin Strut of Sally, South Carolina. It's been going on since the early 70s. This town is all white town, organized by white people, hosted by white people. Thousands of people come to this place. I have on good information that you can smell the festival at about the 35-mile marker. And then we have the side dishes, greens. I talked about those. So this is another photo from Bully's Soul Food in Jackson, Mississippi. And this is a table right off the main dining room. So while you're eating your meal, somebody would periodically come out and strip greens and peel sweet potatoes. So you know you're getting really fresh stuff. I just went there last week. I was in Jackson for something, and the table's gone. I think that's because of COVID, but that was a huge loss. But that, and then you've got black eyed peas, native to West Africa. That is from Chef Marcus Samuelson's place in Harlem called the Red Rooster. If you're a Chef Food Network fan, it's this place. So my Southerners, or anyone steeped in soul food culture, why would I have greens and black eyed peas on the same slice? Oh, you're killing me. Okay, go ahead. Yes. Yes, and what?
Bills and coins.
Thank you. Bills and coins, right? Or some people do black eyed peas for good luck. Good luck. Yeah. Now, here's the interesting thing. There are some people that in their pot of black eyed peas, they will put a dime in there. And you're extra lucky if you get that dime in your serving. It's kind of like the king's cake with the baby Jesus in it. I think this is dangerous. Some people do that. And my other quibble with this tradition is, shouldn't they have adjusted for inflation? It should be a quarter by now. Candy jams, public service announcement. What we call yams in this country are not tropical yams. They are dark fleshed sweet potatoes created by Louisiana sweet potato farmers in the 1920s who wanted to have a sweet potato they could distinguish in the market. And so they bred a richer, deeper kind of orange colored flesh sweet potato with a higher sugar content. And they started calling those yams. All right, so that's why on Thanksgiving, you can go to a market and there's a big old bin. Half of it says sweet potatoes, the other says yams. They're the same, botanically speaking, the same plant, right? And then macaroni and cheese. Oh, and the way you make candy jams is some people bake, but most people boil, and you cube them up and then you braise them in a gravy, butter, brown sugar, cinnamon, maybe nutmeg, other spices. Macaroni and cheese. I was not going to include macaroni and cheese in my book because I just thought it was too universal. But so many of my Black friends threatened to slap me upside my head that I succumbed to peer pressure and include it. But here's the thing, macaroni and cheese has a deep history. It's been around for thousands of years. The earliest printed recipe for macaroni and cheese in English is from the go-to cookbook for Queen Elizabeth I. And that early recipe was just the noodles, Parmesan cheese, and butter. So over time, cream and other things get added to make it to the goopy thing that we love today. So the way that it becomes part of soul food and Southern food culture is you have wealthy white Americans from the South who go to Europe. They get introduced to mac and cheese. They fall in love with it. Thomas Jefferson is the best example of this. And they bring it back and they have their enslaved cooks make it. So in the early 1800s, you're seeing Southern manuscript cookbooks, there's macaroni and cheese all over the place. They call it macaroni pudding and other things, but that's how it comes into the culinary vocabulary. And then eventually African-American cooks and families embrace this as well, because there's no corollary for macaroni and cheese in West African cooking. Then you've got the soul food breads. When I make cornbread, I either make a buttermilk cornbread in a cast iron skillet, or I do cornbread muffins like this. These are muffins from a place called the Hard Knocks Cafe in San Francisco. This is a soul food joint run by Asian Americans. But other cornbreads are spoon bread, which is a cornbread souffle, if you know about that. Hush puppies, right? Okay, does anybody know why they're called hush puppies? Ah, you want to go ahead, tell the story.
I think this is correct, but runaway slaves would throw them at the dogs that were coming after them to veer them off.
So I don't know if that was true, but yeah. So I don't know if that was true, but that's one theory. So with these things that are delicious, there's always a whole bunch of origin stories, right? So that's one. Thanks for mentioning that one. Does anyone know the other story? So the other story is that you've got a bunch of people, African Americans doing something in the woods. They're by a river, and then one of the cooks decides to make fried fish, and they have extra cornmeal, and of course the dogs they brought with them are all barking. And because they smell this fish cooking and somebody decides to ball up the cornmeal, fry it, and then give it to the dogs to hush the puppies. So you've got that story. You've also got the runaway slaves story as well. So that's why they call them. Then there's condiments. Hot sauce is the most popular soul food condiment. Now, Tabasco is the world's #1 selling hot sauce. I'm not a big fan of Tabasco. Is there anyone who's a big fan of Tabasco? All right, we're just gonna have to disagree on this one. I'm more of a fan of the kind of the richer red sauces like Frank's and Louisiana brand are my favorite ones. But there's also another interesting one called pepper vinegar, which is a renewable resource. Is there anybody here that grew up with pepper vinegar? Yeah, so tell us about that.
Well, there were peppers, out of the garden, and it was just always on the table, and you just kept refilling the vinegar.
So it's a renewable resource, right? So once the vinegar got low enough, you just put more vinegar in and let it just wait until it got to the spice level you wanted, and then you would season it. I find pepper vinegar really as a, and I don't know where you're from, but I see it more on the Atlantic seaboard. So like the Carolinas,
North Central Florida.
North Central, okay. I don't really see it in many other places in the country. So when it does show up outside of that, I'm thinking, okay, these people are from this part of the South.
You don't set it next to the window because it ferments and the bottle will explode.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. I'm gonna incorporate that in my future. So one of the things that this gets connected to soul food is that slaveholders did not want to pay for healthcare. So they were always interested in folk remedies and other things in order to deal with illnesses on plantations. In the 1850s, there was a cholera epidemic, a waterborne illness, and people were experimenting, and they noticed that if they added chilies to the rations of the enslaved, the incidence of cholera and other diseases decreased. And so they started adding that to the rations. The high vitamin A and vitamin C in chilies, and so it started out as medicine. In fact, I was looking at a pharmacy journal from 1780, and the early recipe, the prescription for strep throat was this: do a capsicum gargle 3 times a day. Capsicum is the botanic name for chilies, right? And if you look at the recipe, it's the recipe for hot sauce. It was ground up chilies and vinegar mixed together, and you were supposed to gargle with that. All right, red drinks. I told you about red drinks. My theory is that red Kool-Aid is a nod to 2 red drinks that come from West Africa, and you probably had them. The first is hibiscus. Hibiscus is native to West Africa, and as a hospitality drink, somebody would make a hibiscus tea. So they would get water, add the flower petals from the plant, and sweeten the taste. The other one is cola. Now you're probably saying, what are you talking about, man? Cola's a brown. Turn around that bottle, or that can, you'll see every cola you drink is dyed, either yellow or brown or some other color. There are white cola nuts and red cola nuts. And again, it was a hospitality drink. Same formula: water, put the nuts in, sweeten the taste. That's the formula for Kool-Aid. So this hibiscus and other things come across the Atlantic. Cola nuts were a wonder drug in the late 1800s. It's no surprise that Coca-Cola combined cola nuts and cocaine as the early formula, because those were the 2 wonder drugs of the time that drink was introduced. And then hibiscus makes its way across the Atlantic, takes root in Jamaica, where it's called sorrel, and then it starts going around the Caribbean and South America and gets embraced by Latino culture. So if you go to a taqueria and you have agua de Jamaica, Jamaica water, that's a riff off of West African drink. Sweet tea, see, I put it up here. A lot of people argue with me, why don't you have sweet tea in here? So mind you, when I did my research, this was 10 years ago, the world has changed in many ways. Sweet tea was not something you saw outside of the South in terms of Black restaurants. It was usually some kind of red drink, carbonated soda, something like that. Now you see sweet tea more, but I think it's because of the fast food chains, because of McDonald's, Callister's, Chick-fil-A. We're awash in sweet tea. My theory is that sweet tea is going to go the same route as Coca-Cola. When Coca-Cola existed 50, 60 years ago, people thought of that as a Southern drink. No one thinks of it that way now. Sweet tea is going to be the same, I think, in about 20 years. I think it's going to lose its Southern identity. Then let's go through the desserts real quick. We've got sweet potato pie. The interesting thing about sweet potato pie, and you'll find this with a lot of soul food desserts, they're based off old British desserts. The recipe for sweet potato pie is the same as a 400-year-old recipe for carrot pie. You can understand having a sweet root, right? And just swapping that out. It's the same spicing, the same method. Peach cobblers, they emerge in the mid 1800s. The early peach cobblers were made like this. You would have a fire, you would have a big cast iron pot. They would put the peaches in their hole, add sweeteners and other things, spices, and then you would cover it up with leftover biscuit dough. And you would put your lid on it. You would take some coals from under that fire and put it on top of that lid, and that's how they cooked that top crust. So because of it didn't have great baking technology at that point, a lot of the early cobblers did not have a bottom crust. As you get better oven technology and other things, that's where the bottom crust starts to appear. Again, I just think this is dangerous because you've got all those pits floating around in the peach cobbler. That's how people ate them. Here's the interesting thing. Turn of the 20th century, people start removing the pits, and that's when you see almond extract and vanilla extract or rose water added to the peach cobbler recipes. I think that was the cook attempting to impart the flavor that the pits once did. Because you don't see that in the recipes before. Banana pudding, okay, I'm being vulnerable, you know, I talked about setting a electric table, I talked about being vulnerable. This is a banana pudding that I made. And as you can see, my meringue game is not tight. I'm working on it. But banana pudding is based off an old British dessert called a trifle. Trifle was a bread component and cream. So the bread here are vanilla wafer cookies. The cream is that homemade custard or Jell-O pudding mix. I'm not gonna be mad at you if you use Jell-O pudding mix. I make a custard, but that's the cream element. And then you add the meringue and other things in the bananas. Now, this was a luxury dish because in the 1800s, bananas were exotic. Very, very expensive, right? The price was bananas. Sorry, it was just right there. Right? Pound cake, old British recipe, and literally pound of flour, pound of sugar, pound of butter. I find that soul food chefs are most protective of their pound cake recipes because it's so simple that you can bring a lot of your own individuality to it, your own virtuosity as a cook. Those were the hardest recipes to get. And I'm sorry that there's other desserts on the table, but I was in a buffet line at the restaurant and they're about to close the dessert section. So I just grabbed everything. All right, let's go through soul food innovation. We've got chicken and waffles. This is from Cora Faye's, no longer in Denver. They're now at Colfax and Chambers. So this is a fried chicken and a red velvet waffle. We know that that color red does not exist in nature, right? So does anybody know where chicken and waffles come from? Have you ever heard the origin of this dish? So here's the story. The story is in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. You've got people coming out of the jazz clubs at 2 a.m, too late for dinner, too early for breakfast. This guy named Joseph Wells creates this hybrid dish of chicken and waffles, which brings together dinner and breakfast, right? It's a great story, but it's not true. Chicken and waffles actually comes from old Europe. So German immigrants brought a creamed chicken and waffle tradition with them. Waffles have been around in Europe for centuries. And they take root in the Pennsylvania countryside. We call them Pennsylvania Dutch, so that's Pennsylvania Deutsch. And then that dish goes to Philadelphia and becomes big time. So in the 1790s, people were eating fried chicken, creamed chicken and waffles and catfish. Huge in Philadelphia in the 1790s. But then it migrates south and that creamed chicken becomes fried. So Thomas Jefferson and other people were serving fried chicken and waffles as a hunt breakfast on Saturday mornings to visitors. And we have that, this is documented. People have visited, wrote about their meals. So it goes way, way back. But over time, it loses favor. I don't know why. And I think because it lost its popularity, that created a chance for Joseph Wells to kind of create that great marketing bit. I think it was great marketing. All right. This may upset your stomachs. But this is I introduced to you the Kool-Aid pickle. Has anybody here ever had a Kool-Aid pickle? All right. Do you like them?
I do like them.
All right. Here's how you make a Kool-Aid pickle. Get a jar of already made kosher dill pickles. Open the jar, take the pickles out, poke holes in the pickles or cut them. And then you make Kool-Aid with the pickle brine. Okay, you all right? Are you gonna be okay? It's gonna get better, but not by much.
Things not well.
Yeah. Put the pickles back in there, close the jar, leave them there for 2 weeks, take them out and eat them. If you like the taste of pickles and of Kool-Aid, it is just a sweet and sour combination. If you don't like either one of those things, this is one of the nastiest things you'll ever put in your mouth. So now the question is, where did this come from? So I talked to a lot of older African Americans and they told me that they did this. Peppermint pickles. So like little kids, they would go to the corner store, get those big old pickles, cut the pickle off, then stick the pickle in the middle. And hopefully you got a peppermint stick that had a hole in the middle, and that was basically a big straw. And you would just let that dissolve and you would just suck on the pickle. Right? Or if you didn't have a peppermint stick, you could use Jolly Ranchers, Jawbreakers, any hard candy would do. And then there were hardcore people that would do Dixie dust, pixie dust, or Kool-Aid. They would put unsweetened Kool-Aid on there. Are you all right? That's what I come. Other thing is Nashville hot chicken. Y'all have heard of Nashville hot chicken?
Yeah.
All right, now this is born from an African-American restaurant, despite of what you've heard. Nashville hot chicken is owed to this story. So there was a guy who was a known womanizer. True to form, he cheated on his woman, who was a very good cook. So she decided to get back at him by making his absolute favorite thing, fried chicken. But she made a super spicy version of it to burn his mouth out. Dude took one bite of it and loved it. So they ended up opening up a restaurant. It exists to this day. It's called Prince's Hot Chicken. If you go to Nashville, that's the place to go to. Please support that place. They're the ones who started it. But this is now all over the world. I was just in the Middle East and there are Nashville hot chicken places all over the place in the Middle East. Los Angeles got the prize for the weirdest soul food as I ate my way through the country. So this is a place called Tony's Soul Burgers. And I had a Thanksgiving burger. So here's the Thanksgiving burger. Whole wheat bun, all turkey patty, cheese, turkey bacon, a layer of collard greens, a layer of cornbread dressing, a layer of pureed sweet potatoes, cranberries, whole wheat bun. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot, and also an egg, Then they also had a place called Soul Dog, and this is a soul food hot dog. Bun, wiener, collard green and cucumber relish, pureed sweet potato drizzle, crumbled bacon bits. Slammed. All those places closed. Can you believe that? If you're a fan of Good Times, the television show, if you walked into this restaurant, they had a replica of the mural when the credits were rolling at the end of the show. Except everybody has a hot dog instead of a full cue. Let's go through soul food trends. So in addition to traditional soul food, one trend is called down home healthy. And this idea is to take out the fat, the sugar, the salt, and all that kind of stuff. So this is an example of a recipe from a book. This is a Creole broiled catfish. So instead of frying the catfish, you would get the fillet, marinate it in olive oil, sprinkle your favorite Creole seasoning on it, and just broil it for about 7 minutes till it's just opaque. People go nuts for this recipe. It's one of the most popular ones in my book. And let me pause and offer some life advice, because this is a recipe from an ex-girlfriend, right? And good people at First Plymouth, we care about your soul, your love life, everything, right? So if you are in a relationship with somebody who is a good cook, do what you can to stay with that person. But if you notice that things are starting to get rocky, I can just tell you from personal experience, it's a lot easier to get recipes before you break up. We also have upscale soul food. Upscale soul food is the opposite, right? It's about extravagance. It's about heritage, heirloom vegetables, heritage meat, using duck fat, saffron, all these other things. And really it's about more exquisite presentation and other things, but that is definitely a part of soul food. Now, one of the things that bothers me when people talk about upscale soul food is that, that there's an implication that soul food has to be improved. I don't like that. I would just say it's a different type of soul food, but you kind of hear that language.
What is that?
So this is something called Country Captain. This is a dish from Georgia. And it's more of it's a chicken with a kind of a coconut curry sauce. It's a dish that's very popular in Georgia. So the story is that there was in the 1700s, there was a ship on its way to the West Indies, but it got blown off course by a storm and ended up in Savannah. And for whatever reason, the ship was damaged and it couldn't leave Savannah. So they just unloaded all of these spices like curry and other things, and that introduced it to the palates of people in Savannah. And then you have vegan. And like I said earlier, vegan is the hottest trend in soul food. This is where you're seeing the most creativity. And actually, if you go back to what enslaved people were eating day in and day out, it pretty much was close to vegan. They were awakened at dawn. They were made to eat from a trough filled with crumbled cornbread and buttermilk. They had to use their fingers or shells. Does anybody know why they wouldn't use utensils? Potential weapon, right? Chance for rebellion, right? And the slaveholders were fearful of that all the time. And then they would go out in the fields and work. And then at noontime, now this is what they call dinner in the 19th century, but the noontime meal, same trough was cleaned out and filled with seasonal vegetables. There might be a little bit of meat to season the vegetables, but that's it. And then that was, then they would go out to the fields again and work until sundown. And then the evening meal was leftovers from the noontime meal. And that was called supper. So it's very close to vegan. It was only when the work schedule slowed on weekends and holidays that enslaved people got access to more, prestigious ingredients like white flour, white sugar, all these other things. So the glorious cakes, desserts, barbecue, fried chicken, all of that stuff was special occasion food. So vegan was the trend. So this is a place called Solely Vegan in Oakland, California. Moving from left to right, Southern fried tofu, vegan mac and cheese, vegan collard greens, and cayenne pepper lemonade. Tofu was shaped to look like fried chicken, but really in taste and texture, it reminded me of catfish. But that's what they were aiming for. It was good, expertly fried, was not greasy, very, very good. The middle is mac and cheese. Now, I wasn't feeling the mac and cheese so much because I'm used to creamy, right? But that's not a part of vegan. So this was made with almond milk and almond cheese. So texture-wise, it was very similar to stuffed tortellini, if you've ever had that. It was okay, but it just wasn't something I was overly excited about. The collard greens were as good as any. Because those of you who cook, you know that if you know how to season, you don't always need meat. And so these collard greens were very good, and the cayenne pepper lemonade was also good. Another thing you're seeing is fusion. Don't get mad at me. This is what he calls himself. There's a gentleman who is Latino and African-American heritage in Atlanta, Georgia. He calls himself the Blaxican. Don't get mad at me. That's what he calls himself. And he has a restaurant, and so he has things like collard green quesadillas, right? And other things, very, very tasty. And another thing you're seeing is a mix of Asian and African-American traditions with something called the soul roll. A soul roll is a soul food filled egg roll. All right, the core phase sells these. So now this one was chicken and rice and gravy, but they've got mac and cheese, they've got sweet potato, they've got greens. There are even some soul rolls that are filled with everything. So just a fun part of the tradition. And then I'll end by talking about soul food in space. So you may not know this, but every 6 months or so, there are a group of people living in a module on the side of a volcano in Hawaii. This is called the High Seas Experiment. I forgot what high seas stand for. But the reason they're doing this is because the soil on this volcano is very similar to the soil on Mars. So, they're thinking about a peopled mission to Mars. And so they're trying to figure out what can they grow there? And then how can they survive? One way on this mission to Mars is at least a year, and maybe even longer. Just depends on when they leave in Earth's orbit and where Mars is at the time. So they can't put all the food that they need on that ship. It would be too heavy to escape Earth's atmosphere, right? The gravitational pull. So they have to figure out where they're going to grow along the way. So they're experimenting with a lot of things that involve soul food. They're looking at greens, right? You can figure out how to grow plants along the way, and you can be with greens. They're looking at sweet potatoes, okra, and hibiscus, these superfoods. So I actually called up Johnson Space Control outside of Houston because that's where they do a lot of the food testing. And I said, hey, I want to talk to you all about soul food. Believe it or not, they didn't hang up. They invited me out there, and I got a tour of fascinating stuff. And I learned some things about the prospects of soul food in space. Now, one thing is this. One non-starter is cornbread. Does anybody know why cornbread would be a non-starter in space?
No gravity?
No gravity. Okay, it has to do with no gravity.
Crumbs?
Crumbs, yes. Cornbread crumbles, right? So if you have cornbread in space, your spaceship's gonna be straight nasty for the whole journey. Crumbs everywhere. So you can't do that. And the other thing that's a non-starter is chitlins, because you can't roll down the window in space. So thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer your question.
Miller,
Yes.
there was something about the macaroni dish that you just put the.
Oh, yeah, let me explain the macaroni. I forgot to do that. Okay, so this recipe is from Julia Moskin. It's called creamy mac and cheese, New York Times. So this is how you make it. You get cottage cheese, whole milk, and full fat cottage cheese. Okay, whole milk, dry mustard, cayenne, salt, pepper, nutmeg. And then you get a half pound of dry macaroni. So you puree all of the wet stuff and the spices. And then you butter your casserole dish and you mix the uncooked pasta and the puree together in that dish. Cover it with aluminum foil. Cook it for about 375 for 30 minutes. Take the foil, oh, I'm sorry, you have your cheese too, like 3/4 pound cheese, all mixed up.
Kind of cheese.
Yeah, cheddar, just say a sharp cheddar. But any kind of good melting cheese will be fine. Then you take that off and then you have another 1/4 pound of whatever cheese you were using. Sprinkle that on top, dot it with butter. After you've stirred it up to just reincorporate it again, then put your cheese on top, dot it with butter. Uncover, cook it another 30 minutes. I'm telling you, man, on point every time.
I believe it. Thank you.
Yeah.
In the church newsletter.
Yeah.
You recommend a couple of restaurants here in Denver?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we really only have two that I think are really solid. So one is Cora Phase, which is at the corner of Chambers and Colfax. She used to be in Denver, but she's now there. It's a converted Village Inn. Weldon Street Cafe is good, but they had to vacate their building, so they're in the process of relocating. I think their new location is not gonna be far from where they were in Five Points, but that's a few months away. Another place that I really like is Blazing Chicken Shack 2. Not number 1, go to number 2. And it's on 33rd and Holly. So if you know where the Hiawatha Davis Rec Center is and the Pauline Burton Library, it's in a strip, stores right across there.
Say the name again?
It's called the Blazing Chicken Shack 2. Not 1, 2. There's another place called Schwartz on Peoria and Iliff in another shopping center. They're okay. But I really like Cora Phase and Blazing Chicken Shack 2. Yeah. And then if you ever want to do catering, there's a team called Two Sisters Catering, Deborah and Renee Shedd. And if you're a longtime Denver person, they were connected with M&D's. They used to be on 28th and Race. They're part of that family, but they do catering. Yes.
How did you get to the Colorado Council of Churches?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story.
Yeah.
So while I was working at the Bell Policy Center, I was also, my duties in addition to engaging the legislature were to do outreach. And so I knew that progressive people of faith were pretty much ignored. And that conservative people of faith are the ones that get the most volume in our society. And I thought it was important to connect with progressive people of faith. So I became like a faith outreach person. And through that, I met my predecessor at the Council of Church, Jim Ryan. And so I would go to a lot of those meetings, time permitting. But when I started working with the governor, I just couldn't make the meetings because there's just too much going on. I couldn't, So after my stint with Governor Ritter ended, Jim Ryan asked me out to lunch and asked me to be on a committee, and I said yes. So I thought we were going to talk about the committee work, and he said, "Hey, you should apply for my job. I'm going to retire." And then, I had my biblical moment, like, David, Moses, all these people. No, not me. I'm not a pastor. And he said, "You don't have to be a pastor. You just have to have a heart for social justice." So I said, "You know what? I'm just going to go ahead and apply because I didn't think I was going to get it." Especially, but he thought so much of me, I thought I should apply. And I didn't think I was going to get it, especially when they asked me this question. So Adrian, if you're going to explain the theological differences between the Episcopal Church and the Lutheran Church, what would you say? And I said, I wouldn't say anything because I don't know. So I just thought that was done, but I guess they appreciated my honesty. So that's how I got it. So it was through the political work and this being connected. That's our hand back here, yes.
So what is the correct way to cook collard greens?
The correct way, yes. All right. I'll just tell you the way that I do. So what's important, what I do is I get a pot of water and then I like to season with meat. Now, for a long time I did it with pork, but I'm actually getting more flavor from smoked turkey these days. So I put a smoked turkey wing or leg in that pot with onion cut in half, some garlic and some red pepper. And then I boil that to create basically a flavored stock. And then while that's cooking, I'm stripping my mustard and turnip greens. Those are the kind that I like to make. But if you're doing collards, that's fine. I strip them, cut them up into bite-sized pieces. And if you don't have enough time, there are companies now that pre-cut the greens and pre-wash. And then I've just braised them in that water for 30 to 45 minutes. Now, there are some people that say you should do it for hours, and you can do that and they'll be fine, but you lose a lot of those nutrients in the water. See, the thing is, greens should just be cooked until they're tender. Now, if you're cooking kale or collards, there's 30, right? So they're going to take more time. So they're going to be an hour, maybe an hour and a half. But that's how I do my greens. And then, so I have the water on high, and as soon as I put the greens in, I put it on medium, maybe even a lower temperature, and just let them braise that flavor. And then I just adjust the seasoning before I serve them. And I always have mine with some sauces. That's how I do it. Yeah.
There was a YouTube video that I saw because my son gets interested in history and watching things, and it's about the history of food and different things. And he was talking about sweet potato pie versus pumpkin pie. But his comment had to do that it was a political divide that happened between the North and the South. So pumpkin pie in the North was in retaliation, and sweet potato pie is in retaliation to the other in terms of that. So I don't know if.
Oh, I mean, that's an interesting theory. I don't agree with it because I just think pumpkin pie is nasty. So. I love sweet potato pie. Actually, I was hired by a food company. They were doing research and they said, yeah, we're thinking about rolling out this pumpkin flavored product to Black people. And I was like, no, that's a non-starter. Don't even try it. And the guy's like, it's kind of taken aback that I said it. And I was like, no, just do some research. And later we circle back. It's like, yeah, so right. Yeah. So, but truth be told, they are similarly spiced and they do have a similar taste, but I just love sweet potato pie more. But I have heard that. And it does play out in recipe books, but I think it was more about availability. I just think you had a lot of sweet potatoes grown in the South and probably was more plentiful than pumpkins. Although there were pumpkins grown in the South, I just think it was availability. Because a lot of people would, to get through the winters, they would grow massive amounts of sweet potato and then bank them to get through the winter. So I didn't hear about people doing that. Yeah.
So if yams in the grocery store now are really just fancy sweet potatoes, what are the original yams and where can you get those?
So the original yams are tropical roots, right? And you can get them at, you can go to H Mart, any international store or African store will have them.
They look like, I mean.
So they're huge. Yeah, so they're huge. They look like white sweet potatoes, but they're huge.
Do they taste it?
Yeah. I mean, they're starchy like potatoes. There's no sweetness to them. So it's just completely, so you have to know, would you say yams? Have you ever had a sweet yam, a sweet tropical yam?
No,
Okay, they're starchy, right?
yes, very starchy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have to know what you're doing if you're gonna cook those. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I have a question. When you talk about how foods can divide people. And there was just an article about a school that in honor of Black History Day served waffles and fried chicken
And
and
watermelon.
then had to issue an apology
Right.
because of that. And that is my question of the political sensitivity surrounding that. And then after you address that, you need to talk about Dooleyville and West Wing. You just said.
Okay. So, yeah, so it's interesting. So for those who don't know, this has happened a lot over the last 15 years. Essentially, when a white institution honors Martin Luther King or Black History Month or something, they do a menu with these charged foods like watermelon or fried chicken. And if you don't know the history behind this, right after the Civil War, the lost cause was lost on the battlefield, but not in culture. So racist whites launched a culture war, which whites across the country were happy to, share these tropes and racist stuff with their readers. I mean, some of the stuff, you look at the New York Times, the Denver Post, Rocky Mountain News, I mean, racist stuff all over the place. But the idea was to show that Black people were animal-like or childlike and not worthy of these hard-fought rights that were newly bestowed. So it was a culture war. And so even though white people eat all of this stuff, there were images of Black people eating fried chicken and watermelon used in a racist sense. To this point, to this day, I actually know African Americans who will not eat those foods in the presence of white people. or if there's any way that they will be photographed. So this stuff happens a lot. Now, I have mixed feelings about this because I know that those things are two of the most delicious things on the planet. And white people have appropriated it in racist ways. And my thing is like, well, why don't we just reclaim it and take the sting out of it? But there's a lot going on there. What I would just hope is that these institutions would just do some basic outreach to the people they're serving and just say, hey, we're thinking about this. Is this okay? Because to me, you can serve those foods and have a teaching moment. You can serve those foods and say, well, you know, there was a long time that people use this in racist ways about Black people, and this is how it's harmful and things like that. And then you get your grub on, because again, these are two of the most delicious things on the planet, but they're not doing the basic outreach. Believe it or not, there is a big time case with the same company that I was contacted a few weeks ago. They were going to call me as an expert witness to talk about this stuff, but ultimately they decided not to go with me. But yeah, so the Aramark has gone through this before at New York University. And then the other thing that complicates this is sometimes it is Black people on the staff of these white institutions that have fought to have this menu. And then somebody who doesn't know, because there hasn't been proper outreach and context, Black person walks in and just assume because it's a white institution, oh, this must be racist in its meaning. And then here's the other layer. If you go back and look at newspaper articles in the late 1960s, Black students fought to have soul food on the menu at these schools and college in these institutions. So now that this very same food is problematic, it's just interesting. But the fundamental thing is you just have to do outreach to the constituency you're dealing with and just check and see if it's okay. And if they don't want that, then you have to go with that and serve the food that people want. So thanks for asking that. So the Dule Hill story. So when I was working in the White House, we didn't have a lot of money in the initiative for One America, surprise. So we often would go to places and try to inspire people to do race relations work. So we went to Hollywood because a lot of people learn about the other through media, especially movies and TV shows. So I went to the set of The West Wing. And I was on the set, and the first person I met was Dule Hill. If you know about The West Wing, he was the only African-American character on there. I think his name was Charlie. His name was Charlie on the show? Yeah. All right, so we were talking, and then just as a joke, I just said to him, hey man, you know, I tell people your character is loosely based on me. And he did not think that was funny at all. I was like, hey man, good sense of humor. So unfortunately, Martin Sheen comes around the corner. And he's like, hey, you're from the White House, right? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, you want to watch a scene being filmed? I said, yeah. So I went there and we went to the set where the Oval Office is. I'm tripping because the Oval Office on the West Wing set is the exact replica of the Clinton's Oval Office. I mean, everything down to the minute detail. So Martin Sheen was having a problem with his belt microphone. So they gave me a tour of the rest of the set. There weren't many of the stars there that day, but I do remember going to the fishbowl where the writers are. And the production assistant knocked on the door and they all looked up and they're like, wait, who is this dude? And they went back to writing and she opened the door. She said, guys, this guy's from the White House. I'm like, oh, hey man, come on, sit down. Yeah, we want to talk. Yeah. So go back to the set where Martin Sheen's filming. And again, he has a problem with his belt microphone. So two women who are production assistants come out, they're tinkering with the belt microphone. All of a sudden his pants drop. So I turn away, right? Because I don't want to look, I don't want to see this. And then he starts yelling out to me. He's like, hey, Mr. White House, Mr. White House. So I turn around as they're pulling his pants out. And he says, hey, this is what the Justice Department does for the president in real life, right? Like, yeah, Mr. President, something like that.
Yeah, so our Creation Justice Ministry is having a potluck vegan meal on for Earth Day on the 22nd of Saturday night, 22nd of April. So you're invited to come and bring one of your vegan meals.
I'll have to publicize that. All right, thank you. Cool. Yeah.
You were mentioning racism in the Denver Post. Is there a way, because obviously a lot of us are clueless about that. How do we learn about that?
Yeah, so this is disturbing, but there's something called the Colorado Historical Newspaper Collection. It's online. They've digitized a lot of these newspapers. Just put the N-word in. We'll get hundreds.
Really?
Yep. Going all the way back to like 1870. Just put that in.
Oh.
Yep. On that note. Thank you. That was great. So I do have some books here that are for sale. The hardback, I only have a couple of my barbecue books. Those are 30. The other ones are 20. I am so grateful that if you buy my book, that I will sign it any way you want. If you want me to say that I couldn't have written the book without you, I will do that. So thank you so much. It's a lot of fun with you. Yes.
Do you take Venmo?
Yeah. Venmo, yep, cash apps, credit cards, checks, cash, all that.
Wow.
Yeah, that macaroni and cheese.
Yeah, recipe.
Question.